Today we start Colossians, and we'll read it today and tomorrow, which feels really quickly, and we're so quickly reading through Paul's letters. But as I reminded Tosis yesterday, these letters were written to churches which would have been 20 or 30 or so people sitting around together on the Lord's Day, and when they received the letter, they would actually read it in full. Um, it's what they would have done with Philippians. It's what they would have done with Colossians. It's what they would have done with Romans, even. And they just would have read the whole thing in one sitting. So even though we are reading them so quickly, we're reading them twice as slowly as they should be read, really. Um, and I think it's actually good to remind ourselves there's great benefit in reading a letter in its entirety, which sounds really obvious, doesn't it? Imagine that you got a letter in the post from your pen pal who lives overseas, and you opened it up and you saw that it's a few pages long, but then you just read the first paragraph and then you put the letter down again and you came to it the next day and you picked it up and you read the next paragraph and then you put it down again. You would lose so much in the process of doing that, don't you think? These letters are letters. They're meant to be read together. Um, and in this case, I guess reading Colossians over 2 days, it's better than reading it over 12 days or something like that. But I wanted to kind of go with that idea of letters are being meant to read together, and I wanted to choose I think what is the organizing paragraph of Paul's letter to the Colossians. Let me explain a little bit about what's going on in this letter, and then we'll read just the paragraph, and I'll explain a bit. So Paul's writing to this church in Colossae, which is in modern day Turkey. It's near Pamukkale, if you've ever been on holidays in Turkey. His friend planted this church, a guy called Epaphras. Paul doesn't know this church, he hasn't been there before, but he writes to them because he has heard that they're at risk of being deceived by what he calls fine sounding arguments in chapter 2, verse 4. He spells it out a little bit more in verse 8, but we still don't know exactly what he's talking about. So he says, chapter 2, verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world, rather than on Christ. So whatever it was that was spreading around in Colossae, we're not really sure what it was. It seems to have devalued Christ as being hollow and insubstantial, and asked them to invest a certain amount of time and effort into particular behaviors that it promised would be fulfilling for them and bringing them to fullness, it sounds like. So there's false teaching in this church. Possibly, we don't really know how rife it was, how many people have bought into it or not. It sounds like Paul is warning them away from it rather than kind of responding to it as it's infiltrated the church. But Paul's tack is to help the Colossian church by giving them a very clear and very detailed explanation of who Jesus is. He is far from shallow and insubstantial, Paul will say. He is actually the one around whom history revolves, and he is the fullness of the deity. And Paul says that since he is the fullness of the deity, in him we can find fullness as well. Now, I think the key paragraph of Colossians is chapter 1 from verse 15 to verse 20. So I'm going to read it and I'm going to explain it just as we read through it. So verse 15, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. This Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So creation, all things exist because of him and they exist for him. Verse 17, Jesus is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, which is the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. So I don't know if you noticed that, but in those sentences, he draws a timeline. Jesus was before all things. In him all things hold together. And he is also the head of the firstborn from among the dead. So that in everything, Jesus has the supremacy. Jesus was before creation. He holds everything together in creation. And he is the first of the resurrected new world. And so in him all things hold together. In him, in all things, he has the supremacy. And then it says, for God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in Jesus. The fullness of God is in Jesus. Now, I think we grow quite used to that, if we spend a lot of time around church, but it's a huge thing to say. Jesus is God, the creator of all things. And then if you were tempted to think that makes Jesus maybe a little bit abstract or distant, because he is so big and so lofty, verse 20 reminds us that it's actually far more intimate than that. Through him, to reconcile to himself all things. Sorry, this is talking about God. And God, through him, to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So not only is Jesus the creator God, but he is also the God who reconciles all things to himself through a loving and peacemaking sacrifice of himself. So the question that I want you to ask yourself today is, how big is your Jesus? Is he bigger than all of the philosophies and all of the other worldviews and all of the things that are teasing you away from him in this world today? Let's pray that Jesus would be bigger for us, that we would see Jesus clearly. Let's pray. Lord, help us to see Jesus clearly.